You land in Copenhagen, you're jet-lagged, you need caffeine, and you walk into the nearest cafe, you order a coffee, the barista, cheerful and unhurried, hands it over. That will be $15. You step outside, coffee in hand, and see a standard Honda Civic parked on the street. Because of the country's staggering vehicle registration tax, that basic commuter sedan cost over $50,000. To an outsider, this looks like an economic nightmare. It looks like a fast track to consumer bankruptcy. How does anyone survive, let alone thrive, when the cost of existing is this high? Here is the paradox that breaks traditional economic models. The person who poured your $15 coffee makes $22 an hour, gets 6 weeks of paid vacation, and pays exactly $0 out of pocket for their healthcare or their university degree. Welcome to the Danish anomaly. Today, we are dismantling the myth that high prices destroy prosperity. We are going to look at the real math behind the high cost of living, the genius of the Flexicurity model, and why the relentless pursuit of cheap goods in other countries is actually making the middle class poorer. Here is the trap your brain walks into every single time you see a price tag. Your nervous system registers it as expensive or cheap. And in that half-second judgment, you have already lost the plot entirely, because a price tag tells you one thing and one thing only: the number of currency units being exchanged. It tells you absolutely nothing about what that exchange actually cost you relative to your life, your wages, your time, or your financial security. This is the purchasing power illusion, and it is arguably the most expensive cognitive bias in the modern world. Think about it this way. Imagine two workers. One lives in a country where a doctor's visit costs $8. The other lives in a country where that same visit costs $300. On the surface, the math seems obvious. But now add the context. The worker paying $8 earns the equivalent of $400 a month. The worker paying $300 earns $6,000. Suddenly, the math inverts entirely. The expensive system just became the cheaper one. Raw prices stripped of wage alignment are functionally meaningless. They are noise dressed up as a signal. Denmark understands this at a structural level in a way that most economies simply do not. When Danish wages are calibrated to Danish prices, when the entire system is tuned as a single instrument, rather than a collection of disconnected levers, the sticker shock dissolves. That $15 coffee is not expensive to a Copenhagen barista earning $32 an hour. It is proportionally cheaper than a $4 coffee is to an American barista earning $9. The number on the tag was never the story. The ratio between what things cost and what people earn is the only number that has ever mattered. Everything else is theatre. Now here is where it gets genuinely strange. Denmark, one of the most worker-friendly economies on the planet, has no official government minimum wage. There is no federal floor written into law. No politician stood at a podium and declared that workers shall earn no less than X. And yet the average Danish worker earns more than most of their counterparts in countries with aggressively legislated minimums. The barista making your $15 coffee is taking home somewhere around $22 an hour, often more, along with pension contributions, paid vacation and sick leave that does not require a doctor's note to access. So how does a country protect workers without a legal minimum wage? The answer is union density, and Denmark deploys it at a scale that makes most Western nations look like they are playing an entirely different sport. Roughly 67% of the Danish workforce belongs to a trade union. That is not a political statement, it is an economic force of gravity. When 2/3 of workers in any sector are organised and collectively bargaining, the market wage floor rises naturally without a government mandate, because employers simply have no leverage to push it down. The negotiation is between equals, or close enough to equals that the outcome consistently favours the worker. This is a critical distinction. A legislated minimum wage is a ceiling pretending to be a floor, becomes the number that employers default to because the law permits it. Collective bargaining, by contrast, is a living negotiation that responds to market conditions, sector realities, and worker needs in real time. It produces not a floor but a genuine standard, one that rises because organised workers have the power to make it rise. Denmark did not mandate prosperity from the top. It built the conditions for workers to negotiate their way into it from the ground up. If you are an employer in Denmark, firing someone is remarkably straightforward. There is no labyrinthine legal gauntlet, no years-long tribunal, no crippling severance calculation that makes every hiring decision feel like signing a mortgage. You can let someone go with relatively minimal friction. To most people raised on the logic that strong worker protections mean ironclad job security, this sounds like a betrayal. It sounds like the system is rigged against the employee. But this is precisely where Denmark flips the entire framework on its head, and the concept it uses to do it is called Flexicurity. Flexicurity is a portmanteau of flexibility and security, and the genius of it is that it decouples the question of job security from employment security entirely. In most economies, those two things are treated as synonymous. You protect the worker by protecting the job. Denmark decided that it was the wrong unit of analysis. Protecting a specific job in a changing economy is like nailing your feet to the floor of a moving ship. What you actually want is the ability to move freely on the deck. So instead of making it difficult for companies to release workers, Denmark made it extraordinarily safe to be released. When a Danish worker loses their job, the state catches them almost immediately. Unemployment benefits can replace up to 90% of a previous salary for up to 2 years. Active job placement programs engage within weeks. Retraining is funded. The psychological freefall that defines job loss in most economies, the sudden terror about health insurance, about rent, about whether you can absorb a single missed paycheck, is largely absent. And this changes everything about how both workers and employers behave. Employers hire more readily because the exit cost is low. Workers take risks, change careers, and pursue better opportunities because failure does not mean catastrophe. The labour market becomes dynamic rather than frozen. It breathes. And an economy with a breathing labour market consistently outperforms one where everyone is clinging to whatever they have because letting go means drowning. Let's talk about that 50% income tax, because this is the number that stops conversations cold. This is the figure people point to when they want to end the argument. The rhetorical hand grenade that supposedly proves Denmark is paradise for bureaucrats and a nightmare for anyone who actually produces anything. 50%, half your income, gone. Except that framing only makes sense if you ignore everything that comes back. When a Dane pays their taxes, they are not writing a cheque into a void. They're prepaying for a suite of services that citizens in lower tax economies pay for separately, expensively, and often catastrophically. Healthcare is free at the point of use. Not subsidised, not partially covered, not subject to a deductible that can bankrupt a family if the wrong diagnosis lands. Free. Childcare is heavily subsidised, capped at a fraction of what comparable care costs in the United States or the United Kingdom. And university education does not just come without tuition. Danish students receive a monthly government stipend, currently around €900, simply for being enrolled. The state does not just remove the cost of higher education, it actively pays citizens to pursue it. Run the numbers against a comparable American worker, and the picture shifts dramatically. The American keeps more of their gross salary on paper, but then subtract private health insurance premiums, which average over $20,000 annually for a family. Subtract childcare, which can consume $15,000 to $30,000 per year in major cities. Subtract student loan repayments that trail workers well into their 40s. What remains is often less than what the Danish worker takes home after taxes, combined with the profound difference that the Dane carries none of the financial anxiety embedded in those line items. The 50% is not a cost. It is a bulk purchase of security made collectively at a price no individual acting alone could ever negotiate. America sells itself on cheap. The big box store with the cavernous parking lot, the $3 gallon of milk, the television that costs less than a dinner out. And for a specific kind of consumer with a specific kind of financial cushion, this works beautifully. But for the median worker, the person one unexpected medical bill away from a debt spiral, Cheap consumer goods are a mirage that dissolves the moment life happens. The hidden tax of the low-cost economic model is staggering in aggregate. Medical debt is the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States, a statistic so normalised it barely registers as the indictment it is. Student loan debt has crossed the $1.7 trillion mark, a figure that functions as a generational wealth transfer in reverse, pulling money upward from young workers toward financial institutions for decades after graduation. Childcare costs in major American cities have become so severe that some families rationally calculate it is cheaper for one parent to leave the workforce entirely than to pay for coverage. These are not fringe cases. These are structural features of an economy that kept the price of goods low by externalizing the cost of human survival onto individuals. The Dane paying 50% income tax does not have a medical debt. The Dane does not have a student loan. The Dane does not lose 30% of their take-home pay to childcare. Compare the balance sheet honestly, not the sticker price, but the full balance sheet, and the cheap economy reveals itself as extraordinarily expensive for the people who can least afford it. The cost was never eliminated. It was just moved to a part of the receipt that is harder to see. There is a question that economic models often forget to ask, and it is fundamentally a psychological one. Why would anyone willingly hand over half their income to a government? Not under threat, not through enforcement alone, but with something approaching genuine acceptance, in some surveys, even pride. The answer, in Denmark's case, is trust. And trust, it turns out, is an economic variable with compounding returns. Danish citizens rank among the highest in the world on institutional trust surveys. Trust in government, trust in public institutions, trust in fellow citizens. And this is not a cultural accident or a Viking inheritance. It is the product of a feedback loop. Danes pay high taxes. They receive visibly and reliably high-quality public services in return. They see the transaction completed. The school is good. The hospital is clean and competent and free at the door. The unemployment office actually helps. When the return on investment is tangible and consistent, the willingness to invest persists and even strengthens. Compare this to low-trust tax environments, where citizens pay and receive either poor service or the nagging suspicion that their money is being misrouted. In those environments, tax resistance is not irrational. It is the logical response to a broken transaction. The civic compact has failed, and individuals rationally attempt to opt out. Denmark is a demonstration that the opposite dynamic is equally self-reinforcing. High trust systems create willing participants. Willing participants fund high-quality services, and high-quality services rebuild and sustain the trust. It is a virtuous cycle, and it is also a warning. The cycle runs in both directions, and it is far easier to erode than to build. The most persistent myth attached to the Danish model is that a comprehensive welfare state creates dependency, that when you remove the fear of destitution, you also remove the drive to achieve, that the safety net becomes a hammock. It is an intuitive argument. It is also empirically wrong. Denmark consistently ranks in the top tier globally for entrepreneurship rates, startup density, and innovation output. It is not despite the safety net. The evidence strongly suggests it is because of it. Consider the actual psychology of risk-taking. Entrepreneurship requires a willingness to fail. Most people with a genuinely good idea who are also carrying medical debt, student loans, and a family dependent on their employer-provided health insurance will not quit their job to build a company. The downside is simply too catastrophic. The math of risk is not just about potential reward, it is equally about the floor beneath you if you fall. Lower the floor and you do not make people safer. You make them more capable of reaching higher. In Denmark, the aspiring entrepreneur does not lose healthcare when they leave their employer. Their children's school does not change. Their family does not lose its medical coverage. The floor is solid, and so the leap is possible. This is why Scandinavian countries, despite progressive taxation, produce globally competitive companies and punch well above their weight in innovation metrics. The welfare state did not eliminate ambition. It freed it from the burden of pure survival calculus, which turns out to be the single biggest creative suppressant in the modern economy. None of this is utopia, and intellectual credibility requires saying so directly. The Danish model carries real constraints and real tensions, and papering over them in the service of a clean narrative would be its own kind of dishonesty. The most immediate challenge is scale. Denmark is a country of roughly 6 million people, culturally homogeneous for most of its history, with deeply embedded social norms around collective responsibility that took generations to build. Transplanting these mechanics wholesale into a country of 330 million, with radically different historical, cultural and political foundations, is not a matter of policy adoption. It is a civilizational project with no obvious timeline. The trust that underpins Danish taxation did not emerge from legislation. It emerged from shared experience over decades, and it cannot be imported by executive order. Immigration has introduced genuine stress into the system. The Flexicurity model and the welfare architecture were designed in and for a high employment, high participation society. Integrating large populations with language barriers, credentialing gaps, and limited immediate access to the labour market strains the underlying economics and has generated real political friction. These are not imaginary problems conjured by bad faith critics. They are live debates inside Denmark itself. Additionally, the model does compress the ceiling for individual wealth accumulation. If the summit of your ambition is to build a fortune measured in the tens of billions, Denmark is structurally not optimised for that outcome. High marginal tax rates mean that extreme wealth generation requires either extraordinary scale or strategic relocation. The system trades ceiling height for floor security, and that is a genuine trade-off, not a free lunch. So what does any of this mean if you do not live in Denmark and have no immediate plans to move there? It means the lesson was never really about Denmark. Denmark is the case study. The lesson is about how you define the word expensive. Every individual and every economy makes a version of this choice constantly. You can optimize for low sticker prices and absorb the catastrophic line items when they arrive. The medical emergency, the debt load, the years of financial anxiety that grind down human potential in ways that never show up in a GDP figure. Or you can invest in the floor. You can build, individually and collectively, the kind of baseline security that makes risk possible, that makes ambition affordable, that transforms the question from whether you can survive a setback into what you want to build next. The specific mechanisms Denmark uses, the union density, the flexicurity architecture and the tax rate are not universally portable as written. But the underlying principle is, cheap is not the same as affordable. Low cost and low risk are not synonyms. A system that keeps the price of goods down while leaving human survival expensive is not a bargain. It is a deferred invoice, and it always comes due. The Danes did not build a perfect country. They built a country that made a different set of choices about where to absorb the cost of modern life, and the result is a population that, by most empirical measures of actual human well-being, is doing remarkably well. That is not a coincidence. That is the math. And the math, unlike the sticker price, does not lie. If this changed how you think about prosperity, share it with someone still counting the wrong numbers. And if you want more frameworks for seeing through the economic myths that shape your daily life, subscribe, because this is only the beginning of the conversation.